She was not born to be queen. She was born to be devoured. And yet, somehow, through silks and shadows, she wandered too close to the mouth of the throne, where teeth hid beneath velvet and kisses could kill. Catherine Howard, not a woman, not yet a ghost, moved like a summer whisper through a court that drank winter like wine. There was laughter in her eyes. But it belonged to someone else, someone younger, someone untouched. Her skin carried the scent of roses crushed too early, and her breath was that of a girl still dreaming behind the iron-clasped curtains of ambition. They called her queen. They dressed her in crimson. They crowned her with a name already soaked in blood. And still, she smiled, because the knife had not yet turned toward her. Henry, old, rotting, already betrayed by his own body, saw in her the illusion of innocence. And what a cruel illusion it was. Her touch revived him, but her name would rot beside his. A king built of hunger, a queen forged in silence. And around them, the whispers grew roots. The walls of Whitehall learned how to listen. The tapestries began to breathe. Eyes behind eyes, hands behind curtains, secrets wrapped in perfumes and lace. She danced through it all, not knowing the floor was hollow. This is not a tale of love. This is a ritual, a procession of betrayal stitched in flesh. It does not begin with a kiss. It begins with a cold hand on the nape of her neck, and it ends with breath frozen mid-plea. Now hush. Step lightly. The walls still echo. She was raised not in majesty, but in the forgotten corridors of nobility's worn-down skeleton Lambeth. Then Horsham, where discipline slept and memory was a rumor. Catherine Howard, fifth wife to a man who had already buried love under stone, was not sculpted like Anne Boleyn, nor armored like Catherine of Aragon. She was a flicker, not a fire, the soft rustle of silk in shadow. A body taught to smile before it could pray. In the household of the Dowager Duchess, decency was draped in neglect. The girls shared not only chambers, but secrets, and the night was not a place of rest, but of murmurs, games, and stolen warmth beneath the rushes. No one watched closely. No one intervened. So Catherine, half-formed and open-eyed, learned how to be seen without revealing, how to tilt her voice so it landed like invitation, how to cast a glance like a stone across still water. There was no guidance, only performance. Her soul, still untouched by scripture or sovereign, became a stage for the wants of others, a shape molded not by will, but by the gaze of the court that would later devour her. When she arrived at court, the air was perfumed with decay, masked in lavender. Henry's body was a collapsing temple, his leg ulcerated, his breath heavy with rot, but his appetite for beauty had not dimmed. And there she was, laughter in her gait, heat in her smile, unweathered by grief or strategy. A girl among carrion, they called it charm, but it was something older, something more dangerous, the instinct of prey that has never yet seen the jaws. He looked at her and did not see her. He saw the ghosts of his vanished virility. He saw conquest over time. He saw proof he was still king. And she, in her naive and rehearsed elegance, saw only the coronation robe, not the chains beneath. She was 17. He was nearly 50. Her crown was forged not in lineage, but in the aching desires of a sovereign unraveling. And so the palace was dressed in illusion, thick as frost, where power walked in gout-ridden boots and danger came dressed in diamonds. The court, beneath its velvet and gold, pulsed like a carcass infested. The Tudor labyrinth was built not with stone, but with stairs. Courtiers moved with the grace of vipers, bowing as they bit. Men who smiled with ink-stained fingers, women who prayed with daggers in their hearts. And amid it all, Catherine Young, unblooded by consequence, fluttered like a candle in a hall full of breath. She was not taught to read well, but she knew how to dance, how to flatter, how to survive the moment with just enough sweetness to escape scrutiny. But sweetness rots, and soon the scent of her joy began to sting. There were rumors, drifting through corridors like smoke, that she laughed too loudly, that she leaned too close, that her past held shadows no ring could absolve. Yet the king, bloated with the theater of affection, saw none of it. He paraded her like a token of his undying power, a blossom blooming defiantly in his withering garden. The palace, ever watchful, saw what he refused. In the hush between prayers, they whispered names: Francis Derham, Thomas Culpeper, figures from her girlhood and her present, tangled in intimacies she had no language to destroy. The tapestries trembled with it. The walls, carved with saints, seemed to weep, but Catherine danced on, at masque and at mass. Her eyes searched for something only she could see, perhaps a memory, perhaps an escape. But there are no exits in palaces, only deeper rooms. Each day, she wore her innocence like a gown too tight, and each night, she folded herself into silence, praying that her past had not followed her. But the past always follows, and in Henry's court, it arrives with parchment and wax seals. It arrives with eyes that have been waiting, and it never forgets. She had no allies, not truly. Her family saw in her a ladder. The Howards were a nest of ambition, and she, soft-voiced and pliant, was their newest offering to the flames. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, had already tasted power through Anne Boleyn's rise and fall. Now, with Catherine, he hoped to resurrect fortune from the ashes of blood. But the throne is not a cradle. It is a pyre, and those who offer daughters to kings must one day hear them scream. Yet no one warned her. Not properly. They taught her how to curtsy, how to charm, how to keep her voice sweet when terror trembled behind her ribs. But they did not teach her how to hide her past from a kingdom built on punishment. They did not teach her that queens were not wives, but witnesses crowned to be watched, adored to be accused. The king's love was a dying thing. It clung to her like mold to fruit. He gorged himself on ceremony, on displays of youth and fertility, while the court grew colder, more precise. Her every movement became a document. Her letters, her glances, her footsteps all weighed, measured, and recorded in the silence of those who smiled with their mouths and stabbed with their eyes. The queen's apartments grew smaller, the air thicker. She could not cough without a report. She could not sigh without speculation. And still, she tried to be radiant. She tried to laugh, but the sound had begun to splinter. The truth, that cruel, patient vulture circled overhead, waiting. Her sins, real or imagined, whispered themselves into the ears of the righteous. The archbishop, the chancellor, even her ladies, pale with loyalty, began to pull away. She could feel it in the way they folded her gowns, in the way they no longer looked her in the eye when brushing her hair. Henry, for all his rot, still imagined himself beloved. He believed in the loyalty he could not command. And when suspicion was fed to him, spoonful by spoonful, he swallowed it with a rage sharpened by age and humiliation. He had buried queens. He had executed queens. What was one more if it meant cleansing the palace of ghosts? Catherine, in his fevered vision, became a reminder that he was no longer desired, no longer feared, and desire, once wounded, becomes vengeance. He did not summon her. He did not confront her. He disappeared. And in his silence, the court erupted. The queen's name was now a rumor, her past a weapon, and all the doors she once passed through freely began to close. They came for her, not with fury, but with formality. The archbishop arrived like a shadow dressed in law. He did not shout, he simply spoke, and the world changed. Her name was questioned, her history dissected. Names were drawn from the dark and placed before her like knives. Francis Derham, Thomas Culpeper. 2 men, 2 sins, one of the past, one of the present. She was caught between memory and betrayal, and both would drown her. Her rooms became a prison, her windows, interrogation mirrors. She wrote letters she did not understand. She confessed things half true, hoping that fragments might shield her, but nothing shields in a palace of wolves. Her voice, once music at court, now trembled with dread. She was queen in name, traitor in sentence, child in suffering. And no one, not even the king who once called her his jewel, came to offer her a hand. The court no longer smiled. It studied, it judged. The same lips that once kissed her cheek now whispered of her fall. Her family disowned her in silence. The Howards vanished into survival. And Catherine, once wrapped in ermine and praise, was left with parchment, candle smoke, and the tightening breath of fear. She was told she would stand trial, but the verdict had already been signed in the king's marrow. It was not justice, it was ritual. It was history consuming itself again. And through it all, she waited. Each day a rosary of silence. Each night, a dream of escape that ended at the block. They broke her name before they broke her body, in chambers that stank of parchment and damp velvet. The accusations were rehearsed like a play the audience already knew by heart. Catherine Howard, once queen, once adored, was now recast as seductress, conspirator, adulteress. She was not given the dignity of silence. Every whisper, every breath she had shared in darkness now returned, sharpened with ink and seal. Thomas Culpeper's name, once a murmur behind her laughter, now echoed like a bell of doom in every corridor. They claimed she had met him in secret, that her ladies-in-waiting stood watch while sin unfolded beneath Tudor tapestries. And Francis Derham, the old ghost from her youth, became the nail sealing her coffin. He spoke of their past, not with shame, but with entitlement, dragging each memory into daylight where it twisted like a worm beneath glass. She denied what she could, hesitated where the truth was barbed, and begged where she knew the breath of mercy was long since exhaled. But the council did not listen to words. They listened to history, to a king's rage fed on betrayal, to a nation that had learned to mistake execution for justice. The machinery of accusation groaned to life, not with violence, but with elegant scrolls, signatures, formalities wrapped in silk. And as it moved, Catherine was stripped not of her gowns, but of her past, her innocence, her name. Culpeper broke beneath the weight first. In the tower, beneath stones that remembered every scream of Anne Boleyn, he confessed with a voice already rotten with guilt. They said he cried, said he tried to paint the queen as foolish, reckless, craving his affection. But no man in the tower tells a story to save the woman. They tell it to save their skin. Derham followed not weeping, but defiant, as if to claim her even in ruin. He accused her of binding herself to him with promises, of giving him what only a husband should receive. He did not realize that in doing so, he had written her death in clearer ink. These men who had once touched her now carved her epitaph. Every word they uttered was a chisel against her spine. And though she was not there to hear it, Catherine felt the noose tightening in the stillness of her confinement. Her chambers shrank daily. Her attendants, once loyal, grew pale with fear, moving around her like penitents avoiding contagion. No one touched her. No one looked long into her eyes. Even the candles in her room seemed to burn with accusation. She tried to write to the king. Her hands shook. She begged for mercy, for a chance to speak to him not as queen, but as his rose without a thorn. But Henry, now fully consumed by his own rot, gave no answer. He had grown afraid of mirrors, afraid of pity, afraid of the laughter that might return to court if he was seen as weak. And so, Instead of facing the girl he once called his jewel, he hid behind decrees. He signed the act of attainder with a numb hand, his seal pressed not in rage, but in resignation. Catherine would die not because of proof, but because of need. The king needed to be feared. The court needed a sacrifice, and history needed blood to remember her name. The machinery turned, and it would not stop. The tower prepared itself. It knew the script. It had tasted queens before. The axe was polished. The block was inspected. The yeomen rehearsed their solemn steps. And Catherine, still barely 18, began to vanish from the world she had once adorned. Her jewels were taken. Her title was erased. She no longer signed as queen, no longer received the deference of her rank. She became something smaller, something formless, a girl with no name awaiting a death she had been too young to imagine. Her body had once belonged to the court displayed, adored, whispered about. Now it belonged to the crown, and the crown would claim it in full. She was moved to Sion House, then to the tower, each journey silent, each corridor colder than the last. The tower did not shout at her arrival. It sighed, the same sigh it had given for Anne Boleyn, the same sigh it would give again. For queens were not mourned in England. They were replaced. They dressed her for death in grey. No crimson, no gold, no pearls in her hair. Her final hours were not spent in rage, but in terror softened by ritual. She prayed, she wept, but most hauntingly, she practiced. They say Catherine requested a block, that she asked it be brought to her room so she could rehearse laying her neck upon it. Again and again, a child preparing for a pageant of oblivion. Each rehearsal a slow dismembering of hope. The girls who attended her, and they were girls, still watched with hollowed eyes as their queen, no longer queen, knelt in silence, brushing her hair back to expose the tender line between breath and nothingness. The axe would not miss. But fear is a longer blade. Catherine died many times before the morning. She died each time she touched the wood. Each time she felt the phantom steel in air. And through it all, she whispered, not to God, but to the past, to the boy who kissed her in the gardens, to the girl who had once laughed in Horsham, to the body that had once been hers. Outside, the tower green awaited her. The scaffold was set not in grandeur, but in precision. No crowd like Anne's, no pageantry, just the pale winter sky and the eyes of those paid to witness. The axe was held by a man with no name. Catherine, trembling but composed, walked barefoot in the frost. Her steps were small, deliberate. She held no speech, only a prayer, mumbled, fragmented, drifting like smoke. She knelt. She placed her neck where she had practiced. The wind caught her hair. The block was dark, stained from others, and as the executioner raised his arm, she did not scream. She did not move. She simply closed her eyes, as if waiting to be kissed. The axe fell. The world did not end. The court did not mourn. The king did not speak. And yet something shifted, not in England, but in the silence between its histories. Catherine Howard's name became a shadow, a warning. She was not a martyr, not a villain. She was a question carved in blood. How young must a girl be to escape guilt? How many times must a body be possessed before it belongs to itself? No monument was built for her, no portrait saved from fire. She was a race too dangerous to remember, too haunting to forget, and yet her story lingered, not in records, but in the trembling hands of women brushing their hair, in the cold echo of laughter in silent halls, in the way the tower grows still when it remembers. The conspiracy that claimed her was not plotted by men alone. It was written into the architecture of the court, into the gaze that devours, into the hunger that crowns and kills. Catherine Howard died because she was seen, and then because she was no longer useful. They made her invisible. The room where she waited before the final walk had no time, only breath. The stone walls held neither warmth nor echo. They drank every whisper, every prayer, every dream that still fluttered in her like a moth trapped beneath the ribs. Catherine Howard sat with hands folded not in grace, but in resignation. Her fingers no longer trembled. They rested like dead leaves after frost. There was no light except the smothered flicker of a single candle, its flame too timid to cast shadows. She no longer wept. There were no more tears to shape. The weeping had emptied her not only of hope, but of the shape of herself. She no longer recalled her voice. She could barely remember the feel of her own name spoken by someone who did not fear her. They had stripped her of everything but breath, and even that was borrowed. The tower stood still, as if listening to her last silence. Outside, the river carried winter like a secret. Inside, the past circled her like wolves who had forgotten why they hungered, only that they must feast. There had once been music. She remembered it faintly. Masks where silk drifted like smoke, where men bowed with tongues sharper than swords. Laughter layered over lies, perfume over poison. She had smiled then not because she believed in joy, but because she was taught that smiling softened the blade. Now, in these last hours, there was no need to pretend. No audience, no king, only the memory of skin and fire, of hands that held her with hunger, disguised as affection. Catherine's mind circled faces, Culpepper's eyes beneath moonlight, Dirham's fingers stained with ink, the cold hands of her ladies braiding her hair before the court, before betrayal. All those touches had become ghosts now. She could no longer tell whether she had ever been loved or merely adorned. The thought did not wound her anymore. It floated, quiet, unfinished, like a child's lullaby abandoned mid-line. Her breath rose in soft clouds. Her feet, bare and pale, felt the stone like a secret too old to remember. She imagined the axe, not the pain but the weight of it, the final gravity, the end of performance, and perhaps, at the edge of that thought, something like peace stirred, or maybe it was simply surrender. She had dreamed the scaffold long before they built it, in restless sleeps, behind locked doors, when the court still called her radiant, still dressed her in brocade. The dream was always the same, a sky without sun, a crowd without faces, her body small, too small for the silence that swallowed everything. The dream did not end with death. It ended with erasure, with the sound of pages closing, with her name folded into ash. That was the true terror, not the blade, but the vanishing. The thought that no one would remember her as anything more than a whisper of sin, that she would become a caution, not a memory. But in the hours before dawn, as her body waited to become history, something strange and cold bloomed inside her. Not defiance, not regret, but an understanding too ancient for speech, that none of it, the jewels, the titles, the men, the crimes, had ever been hers. Her life had been worn by others, passed through rooms, bent by fingers. She had never been more than a mirror, and now that the mirror was cracked, no one dared look. The silence confirmed it. Even the guards no longer met her eyes. The morning came like a blade, slow, cruel, final. No sun, only pale light filtered through fog. The sky offered no mercy, and neither did the procession. She was taken with ceremony, but no affection, with formality, but no reverence. They walked her down corridors older than hope, past stones that had heard every prayer and answered none. Her breath fogged the air. Her nightgown was clean, her hair tied back not for dignity, but for ease. She walked with small steps, her body betraying its fear with every tremble it refused to show. No crowds gathered, only the appointed witnesses. Men in black with eyes like extinguished lamps. The scaffold was bare, save for the block and the man who would unmake her. She did not speak. There was nothing left to say. She knelt. The wood was cold, her hands folded as if in prayer, though no prayer came. She lowered her neck slowly, precisely, as she had practiced. And when the axe rose, the world did not hold its breath. It simply watched. The blade met her like a conclusion. There was no scream, no resistance, only the fall. Her head struck the straw with a dull sound, too quiet to echo. Her blood soaked into wood that had drunk too deeply before. The man who had once called her, his rose without a thorn, did not attend. He sat in his chamber, surrounded by silence and ceremonial grief, already crafting the image of a king betrayed. And so she died alone, watched only by strangers, buried not with honor, but with speed. No tomb carved her story. No statue bore her face. She was taken beneath earth as if she had never worn the crown, as if her sin had devoured her identity. Her name was spoken in courts with caution, in corridors with disgust, in histories with brevity. But in the hidden places, in the dreams of girls raised to be beautiful, in the sighs of women told their pasts must remain buried, Catherine Howard lived on, not as a queen, not even as a traitor, but as a wound England chose not to heal. The court continued. The throne did not waver. Another queen would follow. Another girl would be chosen. But something in the palace changed. The shadows grew colder. The silences longer. Those who remembered Catherine began to speak of her only in fragments, as if saying her name too clearly might summon the axe again. She became myth, a cautionary tale, a whispered name in tapestries and dust. And yet her death lingered, not in glory, not in tragedy, but in discomfort. She had not been powerful enough to defy, not wise enough to manipulate, not ruthless enough to survive. She had only been young, and in that youth, they saw danger. So they buried her, and then they buried the reason. In centuries to come, poets would touch her name like a bruise. Painters would render her face with invented sorrow. Historians would debate her guilt, her intent, her significance. But the truth would remain out of reach, not because it was lost, but because it was never sought. Catherine Howard was not remembered because she mattered. She was remembered because she terrified. She was the proof that beauty could not protect. That love, once offered by kings, could rot into execution. That girlhood, when placed in the mouth of power, would be devoured and blamed for its sweetness. Her body vanished, her voice erased, but the silence she left behind became a legacy louder than any throne. And in that silence, the tower still waits. It remembers the way her footsteps sounded on stone. It remembers the warmth of her blood. It remembers the way she knelt, eyes closed, as if dreaming. And sometimes, when the fog hangs low and the river grows still, it dreams her again, not as queen, not as sinner, but as the girl who learned too late that being seen is not the same as being known. She was not the first to kneel at the block, and she would not be the last. But something in her ending refused to vanish cleanly. Catherine Howard's death was not the echo of justice nor the triumph of loyalty. It was a soundless unraveling, a girl unthreaded by fear, by spectacle, by hands that loved nothing they could not later destroy. Her name became an ache carved into silence. No relics were saved, no final words carved in stone. Only the vague impression of youth sacrificed to the machinery of kingship. What remains is not a body, not a legacy, but a chill that lingers in rooms where girls are taught to curtsy, to smile, to yield. The tower, gray and unspeaking, still holds the breath she lost, still drinks the hush before the axe. still remembers how soft the world was, just before it broke her. And in that stillness, not holy, not damned, just forgotten, her shadow lengthens. They buried her without ceremony. They buried her without a name. But England, for all its pageants and prayers, cannot quite forget the girl who wore the crown like a garrote. Her story does not end with her death. It ends every time a voice is silenced, every time a name is rewritten to suit the comfort of kings. She was not born for legend. She was born for erasure. And yet, here she is, haunting the margins, curled between the breaths of history, not crying, not screaming, simply waiting to be seen as she was a child, dressed for slaughter. And if you listen closely, not to the sermons, not to the records, but to the silence between you, might still hear her, practicing, one more time, her neck to the block, her whisper lost to the wind.